Welcome, listeners. I'm Ivan Franklin Rose, and this is the one about guilt. I'm dedicating this episode to my friend Carlos, who said this would be important to a lot of people. As we know, guilt can cause stress, anxiety, and a lot more. But mistakes are a part of life. We're human. Hopefully we can learn from them and we can grow. So let's look at what guilt is. An article in Psych Central last year talked about their definition of guilt, that it's a feeling of self-conscious and experiencing a sense of distress about your potential responsibility for a negative outcome. Like all self-conscious emotions, guilt originates from a process of self-evaluation and introspection and may involve your perception of how others value you. Psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud originally proposed humans experience guilt for the first time from a fear of parental punishment. Other psychological models of the concept suggest that guilt rather comes from a personal sense of love and compassion towards others, and it's a result of feeling responsible for harming something you value or hold worth in. My friend Carlos was relaying a story about his friend that they were divorced and they had a daughter, and the mother had abused the daughter before they got divorced and was abusive, and he really didn't want her to spend time with the daughter, but he felt guilty that she would be denied knowing her mom. And the mother promised to get better, promised to seek help, and promised that she wouldn't abuse her daughter anymore in whatever ways that she was doing it. And so his friend let her visit her mom and stay with her mom on occasion and share responsibility. And then later on in life, when the child grew in her older teen years, 18 or so years old, she confided in the father that the mother continued to abuse her. And then his friend felt guilty again for not realizing that the mother wouldn't correct it and would continue her behavior. But it wasn't his fault. He did it out of love. He did it because he loved his daughter and he didn't want to deny her that relationship. So it came from a good place. Sometimes you have to forgive yourself, and we'll discuss that later. But that was his experience. It's like a damned if you do and damned if you don't. If the mother would have corrected herself, then, the daughter wouldn't have known her if he didn't allow her to visit. Since the mother didn't correct her behavior, it became a nightmare and continued to be so. And the daughter just felt she didn't want to say a word. So at this point, we're going to go to and discuss what a guilty conscience is. Your conscious or consciousness is your awareness of self. Your conscience is your innate ability to perceive right from wrong. When you have a guilty conscience, you may be experiencing distress from a decision that conflicted with your moral compass. A guilty conscience is sometimes used to infer someone knows they're in the wrong but may not admit it despite feeling distressed by it. Now, the article goes into emotional interpersonal effects of guilt. Now, according to them, guilt isn't inherently bad. Colleen Weiner, a licensed mental health counselor from Fort Walton Beach, Florida, says guilt can motivate you to change your behavior positively to avoid feeling guilty again. She points out that guilt is often associated with emotional effects like anger and sadness, fear, shame, embarrassment, disgust. And guilt can impact your interpersonal relationships. Colleen indicates common social effects of guilt include withdrawal, aggression, vengefulness, blame shifting, violence as well. Now, let's briefly discuss guilt versus remorse, which comes up a lot. She says guilt and remorse are closely related, but not the same. Guilt tends to be linked to a negative perception of a specific behavior or events, while shame indicates a negative judgment of yourself. This is important to note. And one of the key differences is that remorse is typically associated with a desire to make amends, whereas guilt may not always involve this type of emotion. Now, personally, I went through something with my dad that I just felt I could have done differently, or wished I could have done differently. But my dad, when I was younger, he had a car dealership, and he paid for my college, NYU, and he paid for law school. And when I finished and I was making money on my own, several of his employees wanted to go with me. They wanted to join me, and I was doing very well. And my dad was so annoyed. He just wouldn't talk to me. Now, I didn't proselyte them. They wanted to take the opportunity, and they said, "Can we come?" And I didn't know what to do. But he didn't talk to me for a long time. He said, "If you're going to steal somebody's employees, why not steal my competitors?" But it wasn't intentional. It's just something that happened, and I guess I was too young to say no to them. You can't do it because you're working for my dad. But many years went by. I tried to make it up to him. I tried to call on birthdays. I tried to call on holidays. He wouldn't even take my call. And then when he got sick, he had pancreatic cancer. He was in the hospital. I didn't even know he was dying. And he passed away. I kicked myself for not finding some way to make amends. I felt guilty. I felt shame in that I did not go back to him and see him and somehow get through to him that I didn't mean it. It wasn't my fault. But this is what happens sometimes, is that, life happens and you make decisions and you do the best that you can. But that's what's going on. Maybe some of you had that experience with a loved one, but many of us replay a guilty memory or feeling in our minds. It's a normal human emotion. An article I read said that everybody feels guilty sometimes, but some of us feel guiltier than others, and not always because we've done more bad stuff. That's why it's crucial to investigate where your guilt is coming from and what kind of guilt you're feeling. Guilt is heavy baggage. You don't want to carry guilt around. If you can distinguish where your guilty feelings are coming from, it's easier to see how to get rid of them, whether that means making amends for something, working through the guilt, or simply letting it go. So this article, which was in Yoga Journal, written by Sally Kempton, talked about 3 different types of guilt that they analyzed. First is natural guilt, remorse over something you did or failed to do, like I had with my dad. Free-floating or toxic guilt, an underlying sense of not being a good person. And existential guilt is their third, the negative feeling that arises out of perceived injustice in the world and out of your own unpaid obligation to life itself. So let's look at these in depth. So dealing with natural guilt. Suppose you feel guilty about something immediate and specific. Putting a dent in the car your friend lent you, or lying to your spouse about where you were last night. That's natural guilt. You can tell you're suffering from natural guilt because it's local. It relates to your actions in real present time. Natural guilt can be horribly painful, especially if there's serious damage involved. But even if what you did was really, really bad, local guilt is repairable. You can make amends. You can ask for forgiveness, pay your debt, and resolve to change your behavior. And once you repair things, the guilt should dissolve. Natural guilt serves a functional purpose, and it seems to be hardwired into the nervous system. It's an internal alarm bell that helps you identify unethical behavior and change course. Natural guilt prompts you to call your mother or leave your phone number when you ram the fender of a parked car. Natural guilt, some social scientists believe, come from our ability to empathize with others' sufferings. And it's one of those reasons we have things like social safety nets and movements for social injustice. When you have a healthy relationship with your personal guilt, you don't agonize over guilty feelings. Instead, you use them as signals to change your behavior. You deal with your guilt about not calling your sick friend by calling them. You handle your remorse over spending too much by holding back. If your guilt comes from recognizing your own part in some collective wrongdoing, like racial injustice or some other form of oppression of one group or another, you look for a way to help bring about change. And if your guilt comes from something you can't do much about, like the working mother's guilt about not being the one to pick up her child from school every day, you practice giving yourself a break, which you deserve. This said, natural guilt has a dark side. It often turns into a major instrument of parental and social control. And Old Joe captures this perfectly. How many Jewish mothers does it take to screw in a light bulb? None. Don't worry. It's just sit here in the dark, that's all. So it's not just mothers, Jewish or otherwise, who manipulate us through guilt. Spouses and partners do too. So do religious and spiritual groups and tribes, even yoga tribes. Have you ever been guilt-tripped by a vegan friend who saw you eat meat? In fact, natural guilt gone wrong is when too harshly punished or used as a weapon of control can quickly become toxic. When that happens, we find ourselves in a state of continuous low-grade suffering or toxic guilt, which is a pervasive feeling of being wrong or flawed in some basic way. So let's talk next about dealing with toxic guilt. Toxic guilt is what happens when natural guilt festers. It manifests as a nagging feeling of pervasive but non-specific badness, as if your whole life has something wrong with it. This type of free-floating guilt is the hardest kind to deal with because it arises from lingering patterns lodged in your subconscious. How can you expiate your sin or forgive yourself for something when you don't know what it is you did, or even when you believe that what you did is essentially irreparable? Now, to some extent, this particular type of guilt seems to be an unintended byproduct of Judeo-Christian culture, a residue of the doctrine of original sin. Yogi texts like the Bhagavad Gita or the Yoga Sutra do not recognize nonspecific guilt, though they do say quite a bit about sin and karma and how to avoid or purify transgressions. But even though toxic guilt is not specifically mentioned in most traditional lists of yogi obstructions, the yogi teachings do offer help. We need to work with toxic guilt not only to alleviate the pain it causes, but also because accumulated feelings of guilt build up and attach themselves to any current transgression, even minor ones, causing negative self-talk and bad feelings that are out of proportion to the offense. People normally experience toxic guilt in two ways. First, it can simply be there, like a flavor of your personality. Miasmic feeling that spontaneously come into conscious mind at certain times, causing you to feel bad or unworthy. Second, it can be triggered from the outside, whether by a mistake you make or somebody's suspicion. If you're carrying toxic guilt, a backpack of toxic guilt, it doesn't take much to activate it. A slip up at the office, a fight with your lover, or a call from your mother can do it. In extreme cases, people feel as though they're walking around on eggshells, afraid that they're about to do something they will expose their innate badness to. So it's important to learn how to recognize feelings of toxic guilt so that they no longer program you from the inside. Toxic guilt has roots in early childhood. Mistakes that your parents or teachers treated as a big deal, for example, or religious training, especially the kind that teaches original sin, can fill us with guilty feelings that have no real basis. Some believers of the doctrine of reincarnation, the idea that our present circumstances are determined by patterns set in past lives, see toxic guilt as the karmic residue of past life actions stored in our subtle system. One ancient text of Tibetan yoga called The Wheel of Sharp Weapons lists past transgressions that certain present-day problems have evolved from and gives remedies for mitigating them. Many of the purest yogi practices, especially daily chanting and mantra, repetition, selfless service, and offerings, are considered medicine for these guilty feelings. But there's no question that highly toxic guilt can come also from a cumulative buildup of specific unrepaired hurt that you've caused in this life. When you've racked up a few painful moments of self-betrayal or cheated on a lover or two, or even when you neglect to call your parents or get through regular exercise, you can accumulate a fair amount of free-flowing guilt. Moreover, a yogi on a path of awakening will often develop this highly scrupulous consciousness. Once you begin to hold yourself to an ethical standard of spiritual path, it becomes harder to let yourself get away with insensitive or harmful behavior. At the same time, you may still have some old habits of carelessness and unconsciousness. So despite your best intentions, you sometimes do things that you know aren't good for yourself or other people and feel guilty. But if you're willing to look more deeply, you'll probably find that your sense of toxic guilt has very little to do with anything you did. That, paradoxically, is what makes it so toxic. And when you suffer from this kind of pervasive guilt, any real-time infraction you commit becomes so enhanced by the weight of your stored guilty feelings that facing it can feel paralyzing. Let's go to the third, dealing with existential guilt. Now, existential guilt is quite real, even reasonable. It's when you feel, let's say, it's what you feel when you see a picture of animals in a pen, or read about the suffering in Zimbabwe, or recognize the radical privilege of others. Because there's essentially no way to live life on earth without having, these feelings. Whether it's the owls who lost their homes and a tree that was cut down, or plants you trample on while walking in nature, or the fact that your child got a space in a great public school and lots of your friends' children didn't. Often the resources we use to live, even live simply, mean that those same resources may not be available to others, and thus might cause us some kind of feeling of guilt. But it's not your fault that that your child got into a school or something good happened to you and didn't happen to someone else. It's like a survivor's guilt that, you're the one that won, you're the one that lived and somebody else didn't live. You're on a plane and you survive and somebody else doesn't. A lot of people feel that guilt that's called survivor's guilt. But anyway, modern liberal society, with its intense individualism, broken families, and consumerist attitude towards spirituality, invites existential guilt, simply because so many of us haven't been taught to make the basic gestures that honor the web of life. Talking about not only conscious environmental practice, but also about heart practices like inviting guests to your table, sharing food with poor people, animals, giving service to the community, donating part of your income, and taking care of elders. To complicate matters, when our toxic guilt gets mixed up with our existential guilt, we'll often suffer from a feeling that we're responsible for everybody else's pain. The process of learning to discriminate between true compassion and useless self-sacrifice has to start with checking your guilty feelings when they arise yourself. Whether you're in pain or not fixing something that was related to the present or a toxic hangover or holdover from the past, once you do that, the work you do to help others becomes freed of its sticky residue. You're doing it from the heart and not doing it because you feel guilty. And surprisingly, it also becomes a great deal more effective. We are often confused about what type of guilt we're feeling. Once we recognize a painful feeling as guilt and identify its type, it becomes easier to work with. Some guilts do need amends because the guilty feeling points out a failure to live up to your own values. Other guilts are best to let go. We can learn from our mistakes and make corrections in our lives. That's one of the wonderful things about humans. According to this Yoga Journal article, and I'm not only in favor of their interpretation of things, but I thought it was fascinating the way they look at it. But they say when we believe we are sinners, a very small slip can send us spiraling into a pattern of self-destructive action. But when we know, as the yoga sages tell us, that we are fundamentally divine, it is much easier to forgive ourselves for bad or unskillful things that we do. It's also easier to change our behavior. So the real solution to our problematic guilty feelings is to recognize over and over again the light of God's love that illuminates our heart. Now, whoever your God is, this would apply to, I'm adding, or the universe, whatever you believe in. But know that you are loved. And then you can go on and make these changes in your life. Lastly, I wanted to talk about trying to stop this feeling of guilt. Can you stop it? So, going back to an article in Psych Central, they say that guilt can feel heavy and difficult to unload. Determining where it's coming from can also be a challenge. Still, it's possible to move past guilty feelings no matter how long they've lingered. Learning to manage guilt starts with identifying its source. Some questions you can ask yourself to help understand the root of your guilt include, what happened to cause the guilty feeling? What specific aspect of this do I feel guilty about? Did I really do something wrong, or am I just perceiving I did something wrong? Is someone else making me feel guilty? Is it in my control to fix the situation? Could fixing the situation help? The answers to these questions may help you understand where the guilt is coming from and the best way to manage it. But keep in mind that guilt can also be associated with mental health conditions such as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, which we go through in other episodes. If you have difficulty managing guilt, it might be helpful to talk with a mental health professional about your concern. We're not saying not to do that. Once you understand why you may be feeling guilt, the next step is to figure out how to manage it. Consider trying some of these strategies. Acknowledge it exists. Sometimes guilt can remain hidden underneath other symptoms, such as anxiety or sleeplessness. This can make it challenging to determine what's really bothering you. Identifying whether guilt is the root cause of these challenges can clarify the situation and help you figure out what the next steps are for taking. Eliminate negative self-talk. My mother was a big proponent on this. She wrote several books on how to do that. And I do have other episodes that will go into this more and how to give yourself positive self-talk. But though guilt can initiate positive action, it also can cause you to associate your behavior with who you are as a person. This can lead to inaccurate self-assessment and negative self-talk, such as, I'm a bad person. Try to remember that although the behavior may have been less than ideal, it doesn't define who you are. Find out if there's a reason to feel guilty. Guilt can at times be unwarranted because the person involved has moved on from the incident and has already forgiven you. So think about asking the person how they really feel. You might be surprised to find out that you've been carrying guilt for no reason, or like in the example of Carlos's friend, where it wasn't his fault. He thought he was doing the right thing. He came from a place of love. You have to forgive yourself. Next is remind yourself of all that you do. When feeling guilty, you might have trouble remembering all the positive things that you do, but consider making a list of them and all the acts of kindness that you bestow onto others. You might find that the number of positive actions on the list far outweighs, the negatives. Guilt is often rooted in worries that you're selfish with your time, money, or energy. So the next one is realize that it's okay to have needs. However, it's helpful to remember that no one can be everything to everybody all the time. You also have needs, and they're equally as valid as the needs of others. It's all right to recognize that you have that. Establish boundaries. Guilt can result from unclear boundaries. For example, you may feel guilty when trying to communicate your needs to others, or you may feel pangs of guilt when you don't do what others ask. Establishing healthy boundaries involves making your expectations clear. It establishes what behaviors you will accept from others and what behaviors others can expect from you. Having these boundaries in place can help prevent guilt when dealing with others. Make amends. Sometimes the presence of guilt may indicate the need to apologize for your behavior, a call to action, so to speak. Once these amendments are made, remorseful feelings often seem to fade away. If you can no longer make amends to someone, maybe because they're passed away, you can try journaling, as in the case of my dad. You can try journaling or writing a letter to say what you couldn't say at the time. You can then discard it in some way, such as ripping it up or burning it afterward as an act of closure. Understand what you can control. It might be helpful to examine the source of the guilt and determine, for example, if you feel responsible for something that happened years ago. Maybe it's more helpful to focus on determining what you can do now to help the situation after you analyze it. If nothing can change the situation, bear in mind that holding on to guilt won't deliver the change you're looking for. So try to have some compassion for yourself. Remember that things are unchangeable sometimes, and it's okay. Next, address any mental health challenges. If mental health conditions or past trauma are playing a role in your guilt, it might be a good idea to talk with a mental health professional. They can work with you and identify areas that you may need help with and offer strategies to manage your guilty feelings. Nothing wrong in going to them. Acknowledge that perfection doesn't exist. If you hold yourself to a high standard and even the slightest infraction leaves you riddled with guilt, it might be beneficial to remind yourself that no one is perfect. We all make mistakes. Making mistakes doesn't mean you're a bad person. It simply means that you're learning and growing as you navigate through this thing called life like everybody else. Let's recap. Getting rid of guilt may require self-reflection to identify where the remorse is coming from and why you're feeling it. It also involves determining if you experience misplaced guilt, toxic guilt, or actually regret for something you've done. You can get through this and recognize that you're a good person. We all have good within us, and we all can do good starting today, even if we didn't do it yesterday. Remember, listeners, always wake up with a smile. Always wake up to something that puts a smile on your face. Start your day with a positive attitude, and you'll find that you'll have less time to worry about the negative when you fill your head with positive thoughts and positive ideas. And with that, until next time, I bid you goodbye. Have a wonderful day.